The waters of Khazad-dûm lie still beneath the shadow of 3 ancient peaks, their surface holding starlight like a mirror holds memory. And in that perfect reflection, we find the beginning of all that would rise and fall in the halls beneath the mountain. Here, where Celebdil the white, Caradhras the red, and Fanwyd Hall the grey stand as eternal witnesses against the sky, the Mirror serves as more than geography. It becomes the first page of a covenant written in stone and starlight, a testament that would endure through ages of glory and shadow alike. The lake earned its name not from vanity, but from truth, for its waters possess the rare quality of reflecting not merely what stands above them, but somehow capturing the essence of what lies beneath, as if serving as a window between the surface world and the deep places where purpose would one day find its voice in hammer song. In the elder days, when the boundaries between legend and history remained fluid as morning mist, a solitary figure emerged from wandering to stand upon these shores. Durin the Deathless, first and greatest of the 7 fathers, arrived at this place, not by chance, but by calling, drawn by forces that operated beyond the simple mechanics of travel and exploration. The texts speak of his awakening, though what exactly awakened and from what state remains, one of those mysteries that enriches rather than diminishes with contemplation. What we know with certainty is the moment of recognition that followed, when Durin gazed into the still waters and saw reflected there not just his own weathered face, but a crown of 7 stars arranged in perfect symmetry above his brow, starlight that should not have been visible by day, yet blazed with unmistakable clarity in the lake's patient mirror. This vision established the fundamental covenant between dwarf and mountain that would define everything that followed. Yet it was not the supernatural elements alone that mattered, but the practical wisdom Durin demonstrated in reading the mountain's potential through careful observation of its stone. Where others might have seen only rock and water, peaks and valleys, Durin perceived the hidden architecture waiting beneath the surface, the natural chambers and passages that could be expanded into halls worthy of his people's greatest ambitions. His examination revealed veins of precious metals running through the mountain's heart like arteries carrying lifeblood, natural ventilation systems that could support vast populations, and stone of such quality that it seemed eager to accept the touch of skilled tools and patient hands. The covenant was reciprocal, built on mutual recognition rather than dominance or exploitation. Durin brought to the stone the gifts of craft and vision, the ability to see not just what was, but what could be, while the mountain offered its treasures and protection, its willingness to be shaped into something greater than either partner could achieve alone. This was no license to command, but an invitation to learn the mountain's grammar, to speak to stone in the only language it truly honors, sustained attention expressed as measured work. The crown of stars served not only as blessing, but as reminder that some harmonies must be maintained, even in pursuit of the greatest achievements. The 3 peaks that surrounded the lake each contributed their own character to this covenant, offering different gifts and presenting different challenges to those who would delve beneath their foundations. Celebdil provided the clearest stone and purest waters, its slopes catching starlight and channeling it into depths where it would illuminate the finest works. Caradhras offered the hardest trials and greatest rewards, its heart containing veins that would prove both blessing and burden to those who sought them. Llanwyd Hall stood as steady anchor, providing the structural foundation that would support the vast weight of halls carved from living rock. Together, they framed a valley that gathered light by day and kept patient twilight after sunset, creating a natural amphitheater for the drama that would unfold in the ages to come. Within this emerging culture, the number 7 began to take on sacred significance, appearing first in the stars of Durin's crown, and echoing through every aspect of Dwarven tradition that would follow. 7 springs fed the dale in patterns too elegant for accident. 7 ridgelines met the slopes in angles that seemed choreographed for morning light, and 7 would become the cipher for houses and gifts and fates intertwined. Yet here it was simply a rhythm that made breathing steady underground, a number that could soothe as well as signify, offering comfort to those who listened without impatience. The halls that would eventually stretch beneath these peaks began as whispers in the stone, patterns Durin could perceive, but not yet fully comprehend, chambers that existed in potential rather than actuality. His vision extended beyond mere shelter and storage to encompass something approaching the sublime, an underground realm that would serve not just as dwelling place, but as testament to the highest possibilities of achievement. The scope required not just the labor of generations, but the development of entirely new techniques for working stone on a scale never before attempted, transforming mystical recognition into practical methodology through disciplines that would guard both craft and meaning. Even in these early steps, certain cautions presented themselves, like gentle warnings embedded in the mountain's consent. Durin taught that every span carried a price in load, that every pillar promised safety, only if it obeyed the compression that birthed it, that every void had to be balanced by strength elsewhere. They mapped stress like cartographers of invisible weather, and when they cut with humility. The first halls almost carved themselves from cooperative stone, long naves that drank firelight and returned it, softened, spaces where the first songs were made not to celebrate conquest, but to set tempo for work that would follow. Yet, every covenant carries conditions, and the terms of this particular agreement included responsibilities that would prove increasingly difficult to honor as success bred ambition, and ambition demanded ever greater achievements. The mountain's gifts were vast, but not infinite, its patience considerable, but not eternal, and its tolerance for disturbance substantial, but not unlimited. A realm founded on perfect recognition between ruler and realm thrives only as long as recognition remains mutual, and what was consonance could splinter into noise when attention slipped or appetite quickened beyond wisdom's counsel. The Mirror continued to serve as ritual counterpoint throughout these early seasons, its surface offering both confirmation and instruction to those who returned to test their progress against the original vision. On clear evenings when stars pierced through to the depths, the crown appeared with clarity that convinced even skeptical eyes, while on others it dimmed until only those who already believed could perceive its light. Between these extremes lay the everyday work of discernment, the difference between being led by a sign and being worthy of it, a distinction that would prove crucial as the community grew and meanings shifted with the passage of generations. Before we can follow how this mystical clarity transformed into an empire of unprecedented scope and sophistication. We must understand the tools that made such transformation possible. The moment beside the mirror mere established the destination, but the journey toward that destination would require innovations that went beyond engineering to encompass the very foundations of communication and culture. If vision was to become reality, if the mountain's grammar was to be learned and spoken truly, then the people themselves would need to develop new forms of speech, new ways of guarding knowledge, and new methods for ensuring that the most crucial secrets remained in the hands of those who understood their proper use. What transformed a moment of mystical clarity into an empire of stone and steel was the marriage of divine inspiration with Dwarven determination. But more specifically, it was the development of a language and culture sophisticated enough to preserve meaning across generations, while maintaining the delicate balance between revelation and concealment that the mountain's covenant demanded. The covenant established beside the mirror mere required more than vision to transform stone into civilization, demanding tools capable of preserving sacred knowledge across generations while enabling the practical work of carving an empire from living rock. From Durin's moment of mystical recognition emerged the understanding that language itself must become architecture, creating boundaries that could protect meaning without preventing necessary growth. Thus was born Khazad-dûm, the secret tongue that would serve not merely as communication, but as the fundamental grammar through which Dwarven society organized itself, establishing layers of meaning that honored both the need for preservation and the demands of an expanding realm. Khazad-dûm developed according to principles that reflected the Dwarven understanding of reality itself, possessing a tripartite structure that mirrored their relationship with stone, craft, and spirit. Surface meanings remained accessible to those who learned basic vocabulary, enabling trade and diplomacy, without compromising deeper truths, while technical applications were reserved for those who earned the right through demonstrated skill and sustained dedication. At the innermost level lay sacred significance, accessible only to those bound by kinship and oath, creating a linguistic architecture that could speak truthfully to outsiders while revealing nothing that might endanger the community's most precious secrets. This careful layering ensured that knowledge flowed where it was needed, while remaining contained where it was dangerous, like water channeled through carefully designed conduits that prevented both drought and flood. The concept of craft right emerged naturally from this linguistic foundation, establishing earned authority as the cornerstone of Dwarven society, rather than inherited privilege or arbitrary appointment. Unlike the casual apprenticeships found elsewhere in Middle-earth, Dwarven craft right demanded not just technical proficiency, but spiritual preparation, requiring candidates to demonstrate their understanding of the sacred relationship between maker and material. Each level of advancement opened access to new techniques and materials, while imposing new restrictions designed to prevent misuse of knowledge that could endanger both individual and community. The dwarf who held craft right for working precious metals possessed different standing than one skilled in common stonework, and both were distinct from those who moved raw materials, creating a hierarchy based on demonstrated competence rather than political maneuvering or social connection. Workshop guilds grew from this system to serve as more than professional organizations, functioning as the primary political structure through which major decisions were debated and implemented across the growing realm. Each guild maintained internal hierarchy based on craft-right achievement, but the guilds themselves operated as equals when addressing matters affecting the entire community, creating distributed governance that prevented excessive accumulation of power, while ensuring that decisions were made by those who understood their practical implications. The Longbeards, Durin's folk, stood first among equals through lineage and the scale of their enterprise. Yet their primacy depended on continued excellence rather than ancient claim alone. This system proved remarkably stable because it aligned political authority with demonstrated wisdom, ensuring that those who governed mining operations understood geological challenges, while those who directed craft education had themselves mastered the disciplines they sought to transmit. The relationship between technical knowledge and spiritual practice became increasingly sophisticated as the community developed, with advanced techniques requiring not just physical skill, but mental discipline that resembled meditation more than mere engineering. Master craftsmen spoke of listening to stone, of feeling the grain of metal, of recognizing natural stress patterns that determined where cuts could be made safely and where they would invite catastrophic failure. These descriptions reflected genuine perceptual abilities developed through years of patient practice, skills that allowed dwarven artisans to work with materials in ways that seemed almost supernatural to those lacking necessary training. The use of public runes for trade, while reserving true names for kinship, created sophisticated systems of controlled revelation, enabling participation in broader Middle-earth commerce without compromising cultural integrity. Yet these very strengths carried subtle costs that would compound over time, creating vulnerability disguised as advantages. The pervasive secrecy that protected dwarven identity also isolated them from potential allies, making communication with other races a constant exercise in careful translation and guarded disclosure. Alliances, when they occurred, remained uneasy affairs built on cautious necessity rather than genuine kinship, fostering misunderstandings that could escalate into conflicts when circumstances demanded rapid cooperation. The relentless pursuit of perfection embedded in craft-right, while yielding unparalleled excellence, also created inflexibility that made adaptation difficult when familiar methods proved inadequate to new challenges. The workshop guilds found themselves grappling with phenomena that seemed to exceed their accumulated wisdom, situations where traditional craft-right appeared insufficient to address challenges requiring forms of understanding that bordered on prophecy rather than engineering. Master craftsmen reported encounters with materials that responded to intention as much as technique, that exhibited properties changing according to the spiritual state of those who worked them, that demanded attention resembling prayer more than manipulation. These experiences created tensions within established systems, as some practitioners argued for expanding access to new techniques, while others insisted that traditional restrictions were more necessary than ever when dealing with forces exceeding normal comprehension. The sacred significance embedded in Khazad-dûm's deepest levels began taking on new relevance as the community encountered phenomena that communicated through resonance and harmony rather than conventional meaning, requiring forms of listening that transcended normal linguistic categories. The Seven Fathers had each brought distinct gifts to their lineages, gifts that would one day face magnification and distortion by external forces, while the principle became enshrined that the most profound knowledge could only be earned through direct experience rather than casual instruction. This belief would drive them ever deeper into the mountain, seeking truths that could only be uncovered through sustained engagement with the Earth's most ancient secrets. Technical terms multiplied as new techniques developed, but deeper challenges lay in describing experiences that seemed to transcend boundaries between craft and mystery, between known properties of familiar materials and strange behaviors exhibited by substances that appeared to bridge matter and spirit. These developments suggested that language itself might serve as only one instrument in a larger orchestra of communication, that the Dwarven covenant with stone might involve forms of dialogue exceeding even their sophisticated understanding of meaning and expression. If language serves as civilization's first tool, enabling communities to preserve knowledge and coordinate action across generations, what happens when that tool encounters forces that speak in frequencies beyond words becomes a question of survival rather than academic interest. The answer would emerge through their encounter with Mithril, the metal that sang with voices bridging the gap between geological formation and conscious intention, between the familiar grammar of stone and forms of expression, demanding entirely new categories of understanding. The forces that spoke in frequencies beyond words first announced themselves not through dramatic revelation, but as a subtle shift in the mountain's familiar voice, a new harmonic that entered Dwarven awareness, like starlight reflecting in still water. The discovery of Mithril marked the moment when their sophisticated understanding of stone and metal encountered something that challenged every assumption about the relationship between matter and spirit, between the predictable behavior of earthly substances and phenomena that seemed to bridge the material world with realms of light and song that belonged more properly to legend than to the practical concerns of mining and craft. Mithril entered their awareness as sound before it appeared as substance, a resonance that accompanied certain deep veins like an overtone riding beneath the mountain's bass notes. Survey teams, trained through generations to read stone through hammer tap and echo, began reporting chambers where the familiar percussion of geological investigation yielded responses that lingered beyond normal acoustic principles. These were not the random reverberations of empty spaces or the predictable patterns of water moving through natural channels, but harmonies that seemed to follow musical logic rather than physical law, creating melodies that persisted even after the tools that supposedly generated them had fallen silent. When the first threads of actual metal appeared in the stone, they defied every conventional understanding of metallic properties that Dwarven metallurgists had developed through centuries of patient experimentation and careful observation. Mithril possessed impossible lightness that made substantial pieces feel nearly weightless in the hand, yet demonstrated tensile strength that exceeded the hardest steel, creating paradoxes that forced the workshop guilds to develop entirely new theoretical frameworks for comprehending material behavior. The substance exhibited no tendency toward tarnish or corrosion, even when exposed to the most aggressive chemical environments, maintaining its silvery brilliance through conditions that would destroy lesser metals in moments, as if immune to the corrosive touch of time itself. Most mysteriously, mithril demonstrated a capacity to resonate with both starlight filtering down from the surface world and the deep harmonics that seemed to emerge from the Earth's most ancient foundations, creating connections between realms that should have remained separate according to all established natural philosophy. In chambers where significant quantities had been exposed, craftsmen reported that the metal seemed to collaborate with available light rather than merely reflecting it, amplifying celestial radiance in ways that created luminous effects without generating heat or consuming fuel. This behavior suggested relationships with forces that exceeded normal material properties, hinting at connections to powers that had shaped the world in its earliest stages. The extraction of mithril required techniques that transcended conventional mining, demanding practitioners who could listen to stone with sensitivity approaching that of musicians, tuning delicate instruments. Master surveyors developed specialized methods for distinguishing between random geological sounds and the purposeful harmonies that indicated mithril's presence, creating tools that amplified subtle acoustic signatures while filtering out distracting noise from conventional mining operations. These techniques required not just technical proficiency, but spiritual preparation, as the metal seemed to respond more readily to those who approached their work with reverence rather than mere commercial interest, establishing selection pressures that gradually transformed certain aspects of mining from purely extractive industry into something resembling sacred practice. The actual removal of mithril from its stone matrix demanded precision that exceeded even the demanding standards traditionally applied to precious metals, requiring approaches that resembled negotiation more than conventional extraction. The substance could not be simply hewn from surrounding rock like ordinary ores, but had to be coaxed from its natural setting through techniques that worked with the metal's apparent inclinations rather than forcing it into unwanted configurations. Master craftsmen discovered that mithril responded differently, depending on various factors including time of day, lunar phases, and even the emotional state of those working with it, creating variables that transformed each extraction into a unique challenge requiring both technical skills and intuitive understanding that bordered on empathy with the material itself. As careful mapping of successful discoveries progressed, a remarkable pattern emerged that challenged fundamental assumptions about mineral distribution and geological formation. Mithril veins did not follow the chaotic fractures typical of most ore deposits, but created networks that resembled the branching patterns of rivers or the neural pathways of living creatures, suggesting organizational principles that transcended simple physical processes. These patterns appeared to connect chambers of particular acoustic properties, creating underground networks that seemed designed to channel and amplify the mysterious harmonics that accompanied mithril deposits wherever they were found, as if the mountain had woven its most precious threads according to some vast, patient intelligence. The relationship between mithril and the legendary Silmarils became apparent through careful study of the metal's optical properties, which demonstrated unusual interactions with light that suggested fundamental connections to those sacred jewels created by Feanor in the Elder Days. Mithril exhibited the capacity to capture and hold starlight in ways that ordinary metals could not, creating luminous qualities that seemed to bridge the gap between earthly substance and celestial radiance. This discovery provided the first hints that mithril might serve purposes extending far beyond conventional metallurgy, possibly functioning as a medium through which different forms of light and power could be channeled and focused for applications that would not become clear until much later, when master craftsmen in distant lands would seek materials capable of containing and directing forces that exceeded normal comprehension. Yet with each successful discovery, the costs began compounding in ways that initially seemed manageable, but gradually revealed their true scope and implications. The richest mithril deposits lay at depths that required increasingly complex support systems, creating engineering challenges that pushed Dwarven architectural knowledge to its limits, while demanding resources that strained even their considerable capabilities. Each new level opened required additional ventilation systems to maintain breathable air at unprecedented depths, water management networks to prevent flooding while providing necessary cooling, and communication systems that could coordinate activities across vast underground distances where normal methods of signaling proved inadequate. The workshop guilds found themselves grappling with materials that seemed to possess agency of their own, that responded to craftsmanship in ways that suggested awareness rather than mere physical properties. Master smiths reported that mithril appeared to guide their hands toward optimal techniques, resisting certain applications while encouraging others, behaving as if it possessed preferences about how it should be shaped and for what purposes it should be employed. These experiences created tensions within established craft-right hierarchies, as traditional measures of competence proved inadequate for evaluating skills that bordered on collaboration rather than manipulation, forcing the guilds to develop new criteria for advancement that included sensitivity to phenomena that could not be easily quantified or systematically taught. The role that mithril would play in the creation of the Seven Rings became apparent through retrospective analysis of the metal's unique properties, which seemed specifically suited for channeling and focusing the kinds of power that those artifacts were designed to contain and direct. The substance exhibited remarkable stability when exposed to magical forces that would corrupt or destroy ordinary materials, while its resonant properties enabled it to amplify and refine subtle influences in ways that made it invaluable for creating objects intended to enhance rather than dominate their bearers. These characteristics suggested that mithril had been shaped by forces that understood its eventual destiny, that its formation followed patterns designed to serve purposes that would not become clear until centuries after its initial discovery. As the delving continued, whispers began circulating among the deepest miners about veins that descended beyond any dwarves' mapping, following routes that seemed to lead toward chambers where the normal rules of architecture and acoustics no longer applied in predictable ways. Survey teams reported encountering spaces where mithril deposits created acoustic effects resembling voices speaking in languages that predated any known tongue, where the metal's resonance seemed to carry messages from sources that could not be identified or located through conventional investigation. These discoveries created unease among those who encountered them, suggesting that their systematic exploration had brought them into contact with phenomena that exceeded their understanding and possibly their wisdom to investigate further. The mountain's voice, which had always spoken through the familiar grammar of geological formation and structural stress, began carrying harmonics that seemed to originate from depths where conventional mining had never penetrated, where the patient work of countless generations had never disturbed the ancient silence that had prevailed since the world's foundation. These new sounds created both excitement and apprehension among those who heard them, as they suggested the presence of mithril deposits of unprecedented richness, while simultaneously warning of encounters with forces that might prove dangerous to disturb. Powers that had been deliberately buried in darkness for reasons that remained opaque but increasingly urgent to understand. How would a people who had learned to hear Stone's voice with such precision respond when that voice began carrying echoes of something far older and more powerful than themselves, something that spoke through Mithril's song with intentions that remained mysterious but undeniably present, became the question that would define their next phase of development. The answer would emerge not from the depths they had been exploring, but from an unexpected direction entirely, as voices from the western lands requested permission to listen alongside them, offering friendship that would reshape both their understanding of Mithril's potential and their relationship with the world beyond their mountain halls. The voices that spoke in frequencies beyond words found unexpected harmony when messengers arrived from the western lands, carrying proposals that would transform both the mountain's mysterious song and the dwarven understanding of what their covenant with stone might accomplish when joined with wisdom from realms beyond their halls. The Noldor of Eregion, master craftsmen in their own right, approached not as supplicants seeking favor, but as peers recognizing excellence, offering collaboration that honored both traditions, while creating possibilities that neither culture could achieve in isolation, establishing the foundation for Khazad-dûm's greatest external alliance and its most enduring testament to the power of friendship, transcending the boundaries between different peoples. Celebrimbor's initial overtures demonstrated the diplomatic sophistication necessary for meaningful contact between cultures operating according to fundamentally different concepts of time, priority, and the proper relationship between craft and the forces that shaped the world. Rather than demanding immediate access or presuming automatic welcome, the Elven Lord sent carefully crafted messages that acknowledged Dwarven autonomy, while expressing genuine interest in the unique properties of Mithril and the techniques required for working it safely and effectively. These communications revealed deep understanding of Dwarven craft-right principles and respect for the secrecy that protected their most precious knowledge, creating conditions where meaningful exchange could occur without threatening the cultural integrity that both sides valued above immediate advantage. The friendship that developed between Narvi, master of the Longbeard smiths, and Celebrimbor represented more than diplomatic necessity, evolving into genuine partnership based on mutual recognition of excellence and shared commitment to pushing the boundaries of what could be achieved through patient application of skill to resistant materials. Their conversations began not with grand pronouncements, but with practical discussions of tolerances, stress distributions, and the behavioral characteristics of alloys that responded to celestial influences in ways that challenged conventional metallurgical understanding. Na'vi brought to their collaboration the Dwarven comprehension of stone and metal as living substances requiring reverence rather than dominance, while Celebrimbor contributed Noldorin knowledge of how craft could serve as bridge between material reality and realms of light and power that existed beyond normal perception. From their technical exchanges arose an idea that embodied both elegance and necessity, a door that could welcome friends of either realm without forcing either culture to compromise its deepest principles of privacy and protection. The West Gate emerged as masterwork that honored both traditions without violating either, combining Dwarven mastery of stoneworking with Elven understanding of how symbols could channel and focus power, creating barriers that responded to worthiness rather than mere physical force or mechanical manipulation. The mechanism operated through recognition rather than simple action, opening readily for those who approached with proper understanding, while remaining impervious to those who sought entry through deception or violence, establishing principles of selective access that would prove crucial in trials that lay ahead. The door itself demonstrated technical innovations that neither culture could have achieved independently. Its massive panels balanced on hidden pivots with such precision that their seams seemed illusory, until the proper words were spoken in the proper spirit. Ithildin, derived from Mithril, and coaxed to answer celestial light, traced the emblems of both houses across the stone face, returning starlight and moonlight without heat, while remaining invisible under the harsh glare of day, protecting the gate's secrets from casual observation, while revealing its beauty to those who knew when and how to look. The inscription that adorned the threshold represented linguistic achievement as remarkable as its physical construction, creating text readable by speakers of different languages, while preserving layers of meaning accessible only to those who possessed appropriate preparation and approached with genuine friendship rather than mere curiosity. The trade relationships that developed alongside this architectural collaboration brought prosperity to both communities, while carefully maintaining the independence that prevented either from becoming dependent upon the other for essential needs. Mithril flowed westward in carefully controlled quantities, enabling Eregian's smiths to experiment with applications that revealed new properties and possibilities, while ensuring that Khazad-dûm retained control over both supply and the most sophisticated techniques for working the mysterious metal. In return, the dwarves received not just material goods, but access to knowledge and perspectives that enriched their understanding of their own traditions, creating cross-pollination that strengthened both cultures without compromising either's essential character or fundamental principles. The mechanisms of this collaboration required diplomatic innovations that addressed fundamental differences in how the two cultures understood time, commitment, and the proper scope of shared endeavor, creating frameworks for cooperation that respected both Elven patience and Dwarven practicality. Workshop exchanges occurred in carefully designed spaces that belonged fully to neither realm, where techniques could be shared without exposing the most guarded secrets, where apprentices of both peoples could observe and learn without gaining access to knowledge they had not earned through proper preparation and demonstrated worthiness. the guilds and the Gwathi Myrdain learned to schedule their cooperation against different calendars, creating rhythms of interaction that honored both geological time and the seasons of artistic inspiration that guided elven creativity. Yet every alliance creates obligations that constrain future choices, and the friendship with Eregion gradually drew Khazad-dûm into awareness of political and spiritual developments that extended far beyond their mountain halls, making their security and prosperity dependent not only on their own internal strength, but on the stability of lands and peoples whose welfare had become intertwined with Dwarven interests. The shared secrets that made such collaboration possible also reduced the exclusivity that had previously defined Dwarven strength, creating vulnerabilities disguised as advantages that would prove significant when circumstances changed and former assets became potential liabilities, threatening the very foundations of their carefully constructed independence. During this period of unprecedented collaboration, the rings of power were forged through techniques that drew upon both traditions' deepest knowledge, representing achievements that exceeded what either culture could have accomplished independently, while creating artifacts whose ultimate destiny would reshape the entire history of Middle-earth in ways that no participant could foresee. Mithril's unique properties, its capacity to hold and channel subtle energies without corruption or decay, made it invaluable for creating objects intended to preserve rather than dominate, to enhance rather than control, establishing connections between the mountain's greatest treasure and powers that would soon test every assumption about the relationship between making and meaning. The growing shadow in the east, which had seemed distant and abstract when filtered through reports and rumors, became immediate concern when it threatened friends and allies, whose welfare had become essential to Dwarven prosperity and peace. The West Gate, designed to facilitate friendly exchange while excluding unwanted visitors, faced challenges that exceeded its creator's planning, when the distinction between friend and enemy became blurred by influences that could corrupt good intentions and turn trusted allies into unwitting agents of hostile forces, seeking dominion over all free peoples of Middle-earth. As external pressures mounted and the political landscape shifted in ways that threatened the stability upon which their alliance had been built, the principle became clear that even the strongest doors can become vulnerabilities if the world beyond them changes too drastically. If welcome becomes weakness, and openness invites destruction rather than enrichment. The gate that had opened by friendship learned to close by necessity, not out of treachery to memory, but in fidelity to life, its mechanisms reweighted for defense rather than diplomacy, its approach reshaped to deny momentum to forces that spoke only the language of conquest and domination. How would a people who had perfected the art of selective opening respond when the choice was no longer whom to admit, but whether to seal themselves away entirely became the question that would define their response to a world transformed by malice beyond their mountain's capacity to accommodate or reform? The answer would require understanding not just the diplomatic mechanisms that connected them to external allies, but the internal systems that made their realm capable of sustaining itself when doors closed, and the mountain's breath had to circulate through passages designed for isolation rather than exchange, when the covenant with stone would be tested by siege rather than celebrated through friendship. The covenant with stone that enabled doors to open by friendship demanded more than diplomatic sophistication, requiring invisible infrastructure capable of sustaining civilization across miles of underground space, where the mountain itself had to be transformed into a living, breathing organism whose every breath served the needs of those who dwelt within its depths. When the West Gate learned to close by necessity rather than open by friendship, these hidden systems accepted their renewed mandate with quiet gravity, for a realm could endure without visitors only if it remembered how to breathe by its own devices, drawing upon engineering achievements that exceeded even the ambitious scope of the gate itself in their sophistication and their essential role in making underground life not merely possible, but genuinely prosperous. Fresh air arrived not by chance, but by architecture, coaxed down from high shoulders of stone, where snow never fully vanished, and the wind kept clean counsel with the sky, through concealed intakes that opened like carefully disguised mouths along inaccessible cliffs, where no casual observer would suspect their purpose or their connection to the vast realm beneath. These systems operated according to principles that seemed almost magical in their effectiveness, drawing upon temperature differences between surface and depth to create convection currents that moved breathable atmosphere through networks of passages carved with tolerances measured in finger widths, ensuring that even the smallest deviation from planned dimensions would disrupt flows essential for maintaining livable conditions throughout the deepest levels where the most crucial work was conducted. Within the mountain, shafts descended in staggered segments that broke up dangerous drafts while cooling incoming air against patient stone, then widened into plenum chambers where pressure equalized and temperature calmed before the breath moved onward into the living city, creating circulation patterns that resembled the respiratory systems of vast creatures more than conventional architectural features. Master engineers had learned to read air currents as their mining colleagues read stone, identifying natural pressure differentials that could be enhanced through careful placement of chambers and passages, while strategically positioned outlets rose through angled chimneys disguised within natural fault lines, emerging far from any suspected entrance as harmless warmth that shimmered among scree and lichens, where distant watchers would perceive nothing more threatening than seasonal variations in mountain weather. Water management presented challenges that required innovations extending far beyond conventional hydraulic engineering, as the systems had to provide both power for industrial operations and cooling for forges while preventing the floods and stagnation that would have made underground habitation impossible rather than merely uncomfortable. The mountain's natural springs were channeled through networks that resembled circulatory systems, carrying glacier-fed streams along engineered grades that neither hurried nor dawdled, turning mill wheels where power must be taken, passing through cooling cisterns where heat must be removed, and returning, clarified and unspilled, to join night-black lakes that made the deep glow with patient authority, while serving as reservoirs against seasons of drought or unexpected demand. Spillways nested within spillways created choreography of release prepared for every contingency except arrogance, because arrogance remained the one flood that mapping could not contain, while sophisticated drainage systems prevented accumulation of moisture that could destabilize foundations or create conditions favorable to corruption and decay. The integration of water with forge operations represented perhaps the pinnacle of this environmental engineering, as each major hearth was positioned to take advantage of natural cooling while contributing to overall circulation patterns, their exhaust systems designed to remove not just smoke and heat, but the subtle vapors that accompanied metalworking operations, ensuring that even the most sensitive processes could be conducted without contaminating adjacent areas or compromising worker health. The forges themselves lived at the confluence of these systems, holding place like beating hearts whose pulse touched distant fingers through warm stone, each hearth receiving its allotment of draught and its promise of quenching according to calculations that balanced industrial necessity with environmental stability. The great hammers fell not merely where they were needed, but where the air would carry away impurities, while bringing fresh breath to workers counting blows by habit, counting hours by the deep, clean fatigue known only where purpose and method embraced without friction, creating spaces where temperatures sufficient for working the most resistant metals could be maintained without threatening structural integrity or human endurance. Across miles of passages, communication needed to travel faster than feet and clearer than rumor. So the dwarves taught their mountain to speak back to them in chosen tongues through networks that utilized sound, light, and possibly the resonance phenomena associated with mithril deposits to create signaling capabilities that enabled real-time coordination of complex operations spanning multiple levels. Bronze plates set into certain nodes accepted coded taps that carried along tuned corridors, every turn calculated so that signals would arrive diminished in volume, but not in meaning, while resonant strings stretched along core bells answered like low harps to purposeful strikes, their notes encoded into phrases short enough to remain unambiguous under stress. Light too served these messages, captured from surface sources and distributed through networks of mirrors and polished metal reflectors that channeled starlight and daylight into chambers where such radiance served both practical and spiritual purposes, with the most sophisticated installations incorporating mithril elements that amplified available light without generating heat, creating luminous effects that seemed to bridge the gap between engineering and artistry. This network required not only design, but discipline, because sound that saves can also deceive when untrained hands strike in panic, and light that guides can lure if reflected accidentally at wrong hours, making the office of the listener as honored as the office of the smith. The bridge of Khazad-dûm revealed itself through this context, not merely as elegant span above a gulch, but as deliberate bottleneck designed to control access to the realm's most critical systems, its narrow crossing forcing any large-scale movement to proceed in manageable streams, while its position commanded approaches to central circulation networks that supplied air and water to the deepest levels. In times of peace, it organized traffic into orderly flows, preventing the slow disasters of congestion that can cripple cities as surely as siege, while in times of peril, it concentrated danger into a known, narrow place where courage could purchase time at prices both calculable and grievous, translating space into strategy, while reminding all who crossed that width was not the only dimension worth reckoning. Above these arteries, climbing beyond every hall where light could be sustained by oil and breath, wound the contested rumor that proved itself with footsteps known as the Endless Stair, spiraling from profound darkness to sudden day at Durin's tower in a single braided thought that tied furnace to snow. This vertical circulation served not architectural whimsy, but practical necessity, as maintaining atmospheric pressure and temperature gradients across the realm's full depth demanded access routes that could accommodate both routine maintenance and emergency repairs, while testing the physical and spiritual preparation of those who would work at levels where conventional assumptions about space and orientation no longer provided reliable guidance. Sealed chambers, where the most critical system maps were guarded like crown jewels, represented recognition that knowledge required to maintain these complex networks constituted strategic resources whose loss could prove more devastating than military defeat, as even successful defense would prove meaningless if environmental systems failed and the realm became uninhabitable. These repositories contained not just technical drawings, but detailed records of maintenance procedures, emergency protocols, and accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned through experience how to anticipate and prevent systemic failures that could transform triumph into catastrophe within remarkably short periods, their diagrams showing not just tunnels and stairs, but gradients of pressure and breathing ranges of halls, the way layouts show muscles beneath faces. Yet complexity carried prices that diligence could reduce, but never remove, creating vulnerabilities disguised as advantages that would prove significant when circumstances changed and systems faced challenges their designers had not anticipated. The pervasive interdependence that made such achievements possible also created cascading failure potentials, where disruption in seemingly minor components could ripple through entire networks, while the specialized knowledge required for maintenance created dependencies on relatively small numbers of master engineers, whose loss could trigger crises throughout interconnected systems that had been designed to function as integrated organisms rather than collections of independent parts. The costs extended beyond technical maintenance to encompass spiritual harmony between engineers and mountain, as master craftsmen reported that certain critical systems seemed to respond to intention and emotional state as much as physical adjustment, requiring approaches that resembled collaboration with living entities rather than manipulation of mechanical devices. This suggested that the mountain's cooperation remained essential for continued functioning of even the most carefully designed artificial systems, creating relationships that transcended normal engineering comprehension, while making the entire realm dependent upon maintaining harmonious connections with forces that operated according to principles exceeding purely technical understanding. What would happen if such a finely tuned system, perfected over millennia, to work in harmony with the mountain's natural rhythms, encountered forces that operated by entirely different rules, forces that had been sleeping beneath the deepest foundations, and whose awakening might disrupt not just individual components, but the fundamental harmony that made the entire network function as integrated organism, became the question that would define their next phase of development when the breath of the mountain met something that did not breathe at all. The question of what would happen when a finely tuned system encountered forces operating by entirely different rules, found its answer not in violent disruption, but in the silent arrival of influence that moved through different channels entirely, creating pressures that could not be mapped on any engineer's drawings, yet reshaped the gradients along which all choices flowed. While the mountain's breath continued to circulate according to measured laws of temperature and pressure, another kind of circulation began, carried not through carefully designed passages, but through the more intimate conduits of desire and decision, arriving in the form of a ring of power that would prove both gift and burden to Durin's line, enhancing their greatest strengths, while subtly transforming those very strengths into vulnerabilities that would shape their destiny in ways no council of engineers could have anticipated or prevented. The ring entered Khazad-dûm during the height of the Eregion alliance, its origins debated by chroniclers who cannot agree whether Celebrimbor bestowed it in friendship or Sauron distributed it in malice after Eregion's fall. Yet, what remains certain beyond scholarly dispute is that it came to rest upon the hand of Durin's heir, and remained there for long ages, behaving in ways that confounded every expectation about how such artifacts were supposed to function. Unlike the 9 rings that enslaved the hearts of men, or the 3 that preserved the realms of the elves, the 7 rings given to the dwarf lords encountered minds too compact and wills too deeply rooted in stone to be easily bent, creating a form of influence more subtle and perhaps more dangerous than outright domination, working through enhancement rather than replacement, amplification rather than control. The ring's mechanisms operated by magnifying existing dwarven excellences rather than writing new commandments upon resistant hearts, taking their natural endurance and extending it until labor felt like sustained prayer, refining their skill until tolerances once thought impossible became routine achievements, and enhancing their appreciation of treasure until wealth seemed to flow toward them along invisible channels that no closure could fully dam. Under its influence, master craftsmen found their hands steadier and their perception of material properties more acute, while surveyors discovered that their instruments returned signals with unprecedented precision, guiding delving teams along routes that seemed to emerge from careful analysis, yet somehow always led toward the richest deposits and most promising discoveries. The relationship between the ring and mithril proved particularly significant, as the metal responded to ring-enhanced perception, like a tuning fork struck near its twin, the two singing together in harmonics that made experienced miners pause and close their eyes without quite understanding why. Patterns in ore bodies that had seemed merely elegant now appeared coordinated, as if veins listened and leaned toward hands that knew how to ask properly, while the enhanced senses that made such discoveries possible also began detecting phenomena in the deep places that perhaps should have remained unnoticed. Survey teams reported encountering chambers where mithril deposits created acoustic effects resembling voices speaking in languages that predated any known tongue, where the metal's resonance seemed to carry messages from sources that could not be identified through conventional investigation. Yet these very gifts created isolation disguised as success, as enhanced abilities reduced dependence on external partners, while growing wealth made others increasingly dependent on dwarven favor, transforming relationships that had once been based on mutual necessity into arrangements where the dwarves held most advantages while bearing fewer obligations. The secrecy that had always safeguarded Khazad-dûm and Craftwright took on new defensiveness born not of fear, but of stewardship. Yet the result appeared similar from outside, a people already reticent becoming more self-contained, their walls thickened by justifications that were difficult to dispute and impossible to test from beyond their borders. Within their own society, the ring's influence created subtle hierarchies based on proximity to enhanced capabilities, as those who worked most closely with ring-influenced projects found their own skills and judgment improved through association, while those engaged in more conventional activities seemed increasingly ordinary by comparison. This created internal pressures that channeled talent and attention toward the most ambitious undertakings, as association with ring-enhanced achievements became the primary path to advancement and recognition. Concentrating resources around increasingly dangerous goals that seemed to justify themselves through their very scope and sophistication. The transformation from craft mastery to craft obsession occurred so gradually that it seemed to represent natural development, rather than external influence, as each achievement felt insufficient compared to greater possibilities that seemed perpetually within reach. Projects that would have been considered masterworks in previous generations became merely adequate stepping stones toward more ambitious goals, creating perpetual dissatisfaction disguised as healthy ambition that drove them toward ever greater risks and more complex undertakings requiring deeper delving than previous generations had attempted or deemed wise. Governance adapted by converting caution into procedure rather than reversing course, as the enhanced confidence that made dangerous choices seem reasonable also made them appear inevitable to councils that measured worth by achievement rather than sustainability. The bridge of Khazad-dûm saw new schedules that rationed heavy cargo to protect delicate airflow balances recalculated for increasing depth, while the endless stair received standing orders for patrol and inspection, as the thinness of air at certain turns began varying in ways that could not be wholly attributed to surface weather, creating procedural improvements that acknowledged change in complexity while avoiding confession of change in desire. The ring's enhancement of sensory perception proved particularly consequential as it enabled detection of structural anomalies that appeared to follow patterns suggesting intentional design rather than natural formation, creating awareness of mysteries that demanded investigation, even when investigation might prove dangerous. Master miners reported hearing rhythms too regular to be geological, yet too deep to originate from any known source, while the enhanced endurance that seemed to eliminate natural limits removed warning signs that had previously served as automatic protection against overreach, making it possible to continue dangerous activities until external forces rather than internal wisdom provided termination. The magnetic attraction to treasure operated not just on material wealth, but on knowledge and technique, drawing the most skilled craftsmen toward projects that pushed boundaries of what had been previously attempted, creating concentrations of talent around goals that became increasingly difficult to abandon even when their risks became apparent. The ring's influence made these concentrations seem natural and beneficial, obscuring how they created vulnerabilities by making the entire realm dependent upon continued success of projects that exceeded safe parameters, while promising rewards that seemed to justify any reasonable risk. Political consequences extended far beyond Khazad-dûm's borders, as ring-enhanced prosperity made them essential partners for communities throughout the region, while reducing their own need for external support, establishing relationships where they provided much while requiring little in return. This imbalance gradually transformed diplomatic arrangements from mutual cooperation into arrangements where others sought favor, while the dwarves maintained independence, creating isolation disguised as success that would prove significant when circumstances changed and they needed allies more than admirers. The ring's failure to dominate dwarven minds, as Sauron had intended, created consequences more complex than simple resistance, as their natural mental strength prevented outright control, while leaving them vulnerable to influences that worked through enhancement rather than domination, creating corruption disguised as improvement that proved more difficult to recognize and resist than overt malice would have been. The very qualities that protected them from enslavement made them susceptible to seduction, as enhanced capabilities seemed to validate choices that were actually leading them toward dangers exceeding even their improved abilities to address. The greatest trap proved to be not the snare that captures immediately through force or obvious malice, but the path that slopes so gently toward achievement that no traveler marks the moment when ascent becomes descent, when gain becomes gradient, and when retreat, still possible, begins to look like waste rather than wisdom. Success spoke in the accent of gratitude and inevitability, making refusal sound like ingratitude toward gifts waiting patiently to be accepted, while the ring's pressure remained genial, its rewards reliable, its arguments soft yet persuasive, suggesting that limits drawn by earlier prudence no longer applied to a generation possessing superior tools and enhanced understanding. Thus did expeditions receive charter with blessings and budgets, approved by councils that would have impressed any age for their thoroughness and care, yet whose decisions reflected pressures favoring one kind of proposal over another, one kind of courage over its sibling, one kind of question over its elder. The mountain accepted their footsteps with the dignity of ancient stone consulted with respect, while work crews vanished into levels where ventilation maps thinned and the last notes of their departure songs turned corners to become echoes rather than warnings, carrying them toward encounters with forces that had been sleeping beneath the deepest foundations, waiting for the moment when enhanced ambition would finally draw mortal attention into realms where no amount of ring-enhanced capability could provide adequate protection against powers that operated according to rules entirely beyond the comprehension of even the most sophisticated dwarven understanding. The expeditions that would transform ring-enhanced confidence into catastrophe began not with reckless abandon, but with methodical planning that impressed even the most cautious observers, their charters approved by councils whose thoroughness had been refined through generations of careful decision-making, yet whose judgment now operated under pressures that made the most dangerous choices seem not only reasonable, but inevitable. The ring's influence had created conditions where each achievement felt insufficient compared to greater possibilities that seemed perpetually within reach, driving them beyond boundaries that earlier generations had established, not from timidity, but from hard-won wisdom about the proper relationship between mortal ambition and the ancient forces that slumbered in the earth's deepest places, waiting for the moment when enhanced perception would finally detect their presence and disturb their millennial rest. The techniques developed for working at unprecedented depths represented genuine innovations born from necessity, as conventional mining methods proved inadequate for conditions where normal rules of air circulation and water management no longer provided reliable guidance. Deep mining began where familiar geology surrendered to older, colder order, demanding approaches that treated air not as predictable current, but as sullen reservoir, pooling in hollows and refusing circulation without deliberate invitation, requiring crews to carry atmosphere the way sailors carry wind, hauling bellows on sledges and feeding lungs with measured diligence. Water gathered in lucid pockets under silent pressure, its surfaces perfectly still until disturbed, then restless beyond proportion to touch, demanding choreography that treated motion like quiet dancing, assigning turns so circulation could occur without exhausting lungs or awakening dust that had settled in patterns too elegant for accident. To detect structural integrity in stone, undisturbed since the world's foundation, they extended methods from percussion into listening disciplines, approaching devotion, creating instruments that translated pressure into tone and registered stresses as notes and intervals. Maps were drafted as scores rather than diagrams, corridors annotated with pitches where vaults rang true and pillars kept time, while tripods cradled rods of tempered steel tipped with crystals that made the mountain conversational, teaching patient stone to speak in frequencies that revealed both strength and hidden vulnerability. When anomalies appeared, they appeared as dissonance, scarcely audible yet persistent, suggesting caverns too perfect to be natural, spaces that had been carved rather than formed, worked by hands that preceded any dwarven presence in these depths. The ring's enhancement of perception proved both blessing and curse, enabling detection of mithril deposits that followed patterns too elegant for accident, yet too complex for easy comprehension, creating networks that seemed to connect chambers of particular acoustic properties in ways that suggested organizational principles transcending simple geological processes. Master miners reported that these deeper deposits responded differently to extraction attempts, requiring approaches that resembled negotiation more than conventional mining, as if the metal possessed awareness of its own destiny and preferences about how it should be removed from ancient resting places where it had waited in darkness for purposes that exceeded commercial consideration. Each successful discovery demanded greater risks while raising questions that seemed to demand deeper investigation, creating momentum that became increasingly difficult to resist as ring-enhanced confidence transformed prudent limits into obstacles to be overcome rather than wisdom to be honored. Work crews began reporting encounters with chambers where walls bore marks that appeared carved rather than naturally formed, yet followed patterns that no dwarven tool had ever created, suggesting the presence of other hands that had worked these depths in ages beyond memory or record. These discoveries revealed not just metal, but history itself, uncovering layers of geological time that contained evidence of previous occupancy, artifacts of intelligence that had shaped stone according to principles both familiar and wrong, creating spaces designed for purposes that could not be easily determined through casual observation. The first tremors that seemed to originate from below rather than above arrived not as dramatic earthquakes, but as subtle vibrations that experienced miners recognized as different from familiar settling movements of worked stone, carrying frequencies that suggested disturbance of structures far more massive than anything within their knowledge or previous experience. These tremors followed patterns that seemed to respond to mining activities, growing stronger when work proceeded in certain directions, while diminishing when operations shifted to different areas, creating correlations that suggested causation, yet provided no clear guidance about how to proceed safely, while continuing necessary work that had become essential to maintaining the prosperity upon which their entire civilization depended. The mountain's song, which had always provided guidance and comfort to those who learned to listen properly, began carrying harmonics that sounded almost like warnings, creating musical phrases that seemed to discourage further investigation, while offering no clear guidance about how to retreat from commitments already made and resources already invested. The familiar resonance that had accompanied mithril deposits, like overtones riding beneath geological bass notes, acquired new, dissonant qualities, like melody subtly changing key, shifting from reassuring invitation to something that pressed gently on the mind, like forgotten obligation, creating unease among experienced miners who had learned to trust their ears as much as their eyes, in spaces where conventional vision provided insufficient information for safe navigation. At such depths, where torches behaved like thoughts in cold mines, bright yet reluctant to spread their halos beyond private circles, work crews discovered chambers where conventional tools behaved unpredictably, where metal became brittle or malleable without apparent cause, where stone exhibited properties that changed according to factors that could not be identified or controlled through normal techniques. In one vast hollow, they found columns too regular for accident, running in aisles aligned with nothing mapped above, their capitals bearing no carving, yet holding meaning that pressed against understanding, like pressure against eardrums, while floor stones fitted too closely for geology, and dust lay with ceremonial restraint that suggested reverence rather than abandonment. When they tapped these ancient floors, tones returned with timing, suggestive of vaults below, vast spaces answering with patience rather than distance, harmonics riding on frequencies difficult to hear, yet unmistakable to the ribs, as if conversation occurred through bone rather than ear. Mithril threads along walls brightened under lamplight, then cooled like moonlit frost, coherent yet refusing straightforward explanation, while instruments designed to measure conventional phenomena began returning readings that suggested the presence of entities or forces that operated according to principles exceeding normal comprehension, creating awareness of presences in deep places that seemed to respond to observation with increased activity. The costs accumulated with terrible inevitability, as ring influence combined with institutional momentum to create conditions where the most dangerous choices appeared reasonable to councils that measured success through achievement rather than sustainability, making continuation seem inevitable, despite mounting evidence that they were approaching limits that should not be crossed. The enhanced endurance that seemed to eliminate natural limits removed warning signs that had previously served as automatic protection against overreach, while the magnetic attraction to treasure operated not just on material wealth, but on knowledge and discovery, drawing the most skilled practitioners toward projects that became increasingly difficult to abandon, even when their risks became undeniably apparent to those who possessed wisdom to interpret accumulating signs. Communication with surface levels became increasingly difficult as depths exceeded the range of conventional signaling systems, creating delays in decision-making that allowed dangerous situations to develop beyond the point where they could be easily corrected through conventional intervention, while the installation of extended networks required resources and expertise that strained the realm's capabilities, consuming attention that should have been devoted to safety considerations and risk assessment. The question that haunted these ultimate ventures, whispered in corridors where ventilation carried voices farther than intended, became not whether they would find what they sought, but whether what they found would prove worth the price of discovery. What lies beneath the bottom of the world became more than philosophical. Speculation as their deepest delving brought them into contact with presences that had been sleeping in darkness since the elder days, waiting for the moment when mortal ambition would finally disturb their ancient rest and awaken forces whose power exceeded any preparation their ring-enhanced capabilities could provide, transforming achievement into catastrophe through encounters that would reshape not just their understanding of the mountain's depths, but their entire relationship with the realm they had carved from cooperative stone that had suddenly, terrifyingly, ceased to cooperate. The question of what lay beneath the bottom of the world received its answer not through patient investigation, but through catastrophic revelation, arriving as whispers before words, carrying through stone as pressure rather than proclamation, transforming accumulated vibrations from their deepest mining operations into the mechanism that finally disturbed something that had been sleeping in darkness since the elder days. The awakening came not as sudden explosion, but as gradual recognition that the tremors they had attributed to settling stone actually represented the stirring of presence, vast and ancient, whose dormancy had been mistaken for absence until the moment when accumulated disturbance crossed thresholds that should never have been approached, turning their greatest achievement into their most terrible peril through forces that made inevitability seem like choice, until choice was no longer available. The Balrog emerged from depths that exceeded mapping, not as monster, but as force of nature given form and malice, fire and shadow woven together in proportions that challenged every assumption about the relationship between matter and spirit, between geological formation and conscious intention. Vibration became the first mechanism of awakening, as countless hammer blows and the patient rhythms of extraction piled infinitesimal flexions into patterns the mountain could not diffuse, until stress traveled along forgotten corridors, like scouts sent ahead of an army that had been marshalling itself in darkness for millennia. Heat followed, at first a suspicion along tool handles, then a reordering of drafts that turned comfortable currents fickle and strange, while lamps guttered in pockets where the air seemed to retreat from flame, as if the mountain had begun to breathe on its own, ignoring the agreed tempo entirely. Those who kept the oldest stories recognized the pattern even before a name could be spoken with certainty, understanding that they faced not merely a creature to be hunted, but a phenomenon to be endured, one of the spirits of fire that had been bent to dark will in the elder days, and fled beneath mountains to escape judgment, where age had turned malice into element and intention into habit. It lay like banked furnace under ash, not dead but folded, and the miner's patient rhythms unfolded it, stroke by well-meant stroke, until something ancient shifted from remembering how to wake to actually waking, bringing with it powers that operated according to principles that exceeded any mortal capacity to comprehend or resist. The creature's awakening destabilized both physical and spiritual foundations of the realm simultaneously, its presence operating through principles that made familiar passages unreliable, as structural integrity fluctuated according to proximity to its location and intensity of its attention. The finely tuned systems of air circulation, once triumph of Dwarven ingenuity, warped and choked as invisible heat and oppressive shadow pulled smoke from distant forges into working chambers, while turning breathable currents into suffocating eddies that made coordination impossible and evacuation desperate. Water systems designed with such precision to provide power and cooling without flood or stagnation began behaving erratically, as pipes burst and channels overflowed in places where no pressure should have built, disrupting the delicate balance that had sustained life in the deep places for countless generations. The first direct encounters revealed the inadequacy of conventional resistance, as weapons and armor designed for mortal conflicts proved useless against entity whose very existence challenged boundaries between physical and spiritual reality, whose attacks operated through principles that made defense impossible rather than merely difficult. During the 6th, the king who reigned when shadow first stirred perished with many of his folk in the initial confrontation, his defiance against ancient evil proving as futile as attempting to dam volcanic eruption with bare hands, while his son Nain, who briefly took up crown and impossible fight, soon followed him into death, consumed by the very flames he sought to quell, through courage that proved meaningless when confronted with destruction that moved like thought, yet struck like avalanche. The death of kings occurred not through heroic last stands, but through simple mathematics of proximity and exposure, as leadership trained to face danger from the front discovered that valor provided no protection against forces that operated beyond reach of mortal comprehension, while enhanced endurance that ring influence had provided proved insufficient when confronted with destruction that exceeded any enhancement mortal artifacts could bestow. Command structures that had functioned effectively for centuries collapsed not through failure of will, but through elimination of those whose experience and judgment had made complex coordination possible, creating vacuum of authority at the moment when decisive action became essential for survival rather than merely success. Evacuation of entire levels began as organized withdrawal, but transformed into desperate flight as the creature's influence spread through passages designed for controlled movement, turning familiar routes into death traps, while making emergency procedures inadequate for circumstances that exceeded worst-case planning scenarios. The sophisticated communication networks that had enabled coordination across vast distances became conduits for terror, as reports arrived faster than responses could be formulated, creating information overload that paralyzed decision-making, when rapid, decisive action offered the only hope for preserving any portion of their civilization from complete destruction. In those desperate hours, architectural marvels revealed purposes that their creators had hoped would never need fulfillment. As the bridge of Khazad-dûm transformed from symbol of connection into deliberate bottleneck, where desperate stand could be made, its narrow span designed not for beauty, but for necessity, creating choke point where creatures' advance could be slowed, while evacuation proceeded through routes that had been planned for testing worthiness, but now served survival itself. The bridge's position commanded access to central circulation networks, while providing defensible position where few could delay many, not to defeat, but to permit life to pass safely upstream, translating architectural achievement into strategic necessity through calculations that measured space in terms of time purchased rather than distance traversed. The endless stair assumed new significance as escape route for the desperate, its vertical circulation serving not routine maintenance, but salvation itself. As those who possessed strength and determination to attempt the climb discovered that architectural features designed for testing physical and spiritual preparation now offered the only path to safety that remained accessible when conventional exits became impassable. The stairs' demanding ascent, which had previously ensured that only the worthy gained access to the realm's highest secrets, now provided deliverance for those whose worthiness was measured not by preparation, but by simple refusal to surrender to circumstances that seemed to demand despair. Yet even as evacuation proceeded, with whatever order could be maintained under such conditions, the most terrible realization emerged that this was not temporary crisis that could be resolved through sufficient courage and proper planning, but fundamental transformation that made their ancestral home uninhabitable for any who lacked power to contend with forces that had been deliberately buried in darkness, for reasons that were becoming horrifyingly clear. The creature's presence created conditions that made normal life impossible, not through active malice alone, but through simple incompatibility between mortal needs and environment its awakening had created, turning halls that had echoed with hammer and song into spaces where survival itself required constant vigilance and resources that exceeded any sustainable expenditure. The mountain's song, which had always provided guidance and comfort to those who learned to listen properly, became cacophony of warning and lament that made concentration impossible, while offering no useful information about how to address circumstances that exceeded traditional wisdom. As the familiar resonance that had accompanied their work for generations acquired new, dissonant qualities that pressed against understanding, like pressure against eardrums, suggesting that their covenant with stone had been not merely interrupted, but fundamentally altered by awakening of powers that recognized no mortal authority or negotiation. The decision that would define Dwarven culture for generations crystallized around recognition that their greatest treasures were not compatible with each other, that preservation of their halls would require sacrifice of their lives, while preservation of their people demanded abandonment of achievements that had defined their identity for millennia. The choice between fighting for their home and preserving their culture proved false, as circumstances made clear that the home they had known no longer existed, that the mountain's cooperation had been withdrawn not through treachery, but through awakening of forces whose presence made cooperation impossible rather than merely difficult. How does a civilization choose between its greatest treasure and its greatest treasure? Between halls that embody millennia of achievement and lives that represent continuation of everything that made those achievements meaningful, became question that could not be answered through council deliberation or traditional decision-making processes, as circumstances demanded immediate action, while providing no precedent for guidance and no time for careful consideration that such momentous choices normally required. The answer would emerge not through wisdom, but through necessity, as those who survived would carry forward not the stones they had shaped, but the knowledge of how stones could be shaped, not the halls they had carved, but the songs that had guided the carving, preserving in memory and tradition what could not be preserved in place. Learning that some forms of treasure can only be saved by being carried rather than defended. The choice between preservation and pride resolved itself through architecture that had been designed with wisdom exceeding its creator's conscious understanding, revealing in desperate hours that the bridge of Khazad-dûm embodied not mere engineering excellence, but a philosophy carved in stone that valued life over halls, continuation over completion, the preservation of people over the defense of place. What had been built to showcase mastery now revealed its deeper purpose through arithmetic more profound than any surface calculation, transforming elegant span into sacred bottleneck, where strategic withdrawal could be conducted with dignity rather than desperation, where the narrow crossing that had once facilitated connection would now enable separation measured not in distance, but in lives preserved through sacrifice that honored both necessity and choice. The bridge's slender proportions, so often admired for their aesthetic achievement, proved to be calculations of survival rendered in stone, creating choke point where few could delay many not to achieve victory, but to purchase time, translating architectural beauty into tactical necessity through mathematics that measured success in evacuees rather than enemies defeated. Its single-file crossing forced any pursuit to abandon momentum and accept negotiation measured in heartbeats, while the chasm beneath permitted no flanking maneuvers or second attempts, creating conditions where courage could be converted into minutes, with precision that would have impressed any engineer calculating load distributions or stress tolerances under more peaceful circumstances. Sealed passages that had once provided security against external threats became instruments of choreographed withdrawal, their triggers activated not by enemy approach, but by desperate necessity that transformed defensive measures into tools of strategic retreat. These barriers had been designed by generations of builders who understood that the greatest engineering served not just prosperity, but survival, creating systems that could function in reverse when circumstances demanded evacuation rather than expansion, their massive stone blocks sliding into place with earth-shaking finality that denied access while preserving structural integrity of passages essential for continued escape. Beyond these deliberate closures, collapsed tunnels served as both barriers and messages, their destruction carefully orchestrated to channel pursuit along predictable routes while protecting evacuation corridors through choreography of ruin that demonstrated how destruction could serve creation when applied with wisdom, born from understanding system function under extreme stress. Master engineers worked with desperate precision to ensure that each collapse served multiple purposes, buying time while preserving options, creating maze of blocked approaches that forced unwanted visitors into confined spaces where their advance could be momentarily contained, while streams of departing dwarves made their way toward levels where mountain's breath still carried hope rather than heat. The endless stair assumed new significance as escape route for the desperate, its demanding vertical circulation serving not routine maintenance, but salvation itself. As those who possessed strength and determination to attempt the climb discovered that architectural features designed for testing physical and spiritual preparation now offered deliverance measured not in worthiness, achieved, but in simple refusal to surrender to circumstances that seemed to demand despair. Upward moved not just bodies, but the essential elements of their civilization, lists and ledgers wrapped in oiled cloth, seed stocks of craft knowledge, patterns etched on metal leaves that would not burn, and children whose eyes learned the curve of stone by candlelight and prayer, while below them the mountain began closing behind its people with finality that honored both grief and gratitude. The terrible mathematics of sacrifice revealed themselves through decisions that could not be delayed for consultation or softened through compromise, as circumstances demanded immediate action based on calculations that weighed individual lives against collective survival, personal attachment against cultural continuation, immediate loss against ultimate preservation. Those who volunteered to hold critical positions understood that their stand served not glory, but necessity, that their deaths would purchase not victory, but time, that their sacrifice would be measured not in enemies defeated, but in friends preserved, creating heroism that transcended conventional understanding of courage to embody wisdom about what truly mattered when everything familiar was being lost through forces exceeding any mortal capacity to resist or reform. Yet the costs extended far beyond lives lost in rearguard actions, encompassing transformation of identity that changed Durin's folk from settled people with ancestral home to wanderers carrying their culture in memory rather than stone. Their connection to place severed by circumstances that made return impossible rather than merely difficult. At the Mirrormere some paused and looked down, searching for the crown that had once defined their mandate, and though stars still answered water with ancient fidelity, the image carried grief now, a circlet made of memory alone, while vows were spoken in tones too even to mistake for oaths of conquest, becoming instead promises to remain as a people, even if halls could not. Records and treasures left behind represented not mere material loss, but abandonment of accumulated knowledge that had taken millennia to develop, creating gaps in cultural continuity that would affect future generations in ways that could not be fully anticipated or prepared for through conventional planning. Sealed vaults that might still hold Dwarven secrets were closed with inscriptions that were not instructions, but warnings dressed as courtesy, their contents preserved, but inaccessible, creating a situation where wisdom existed, but could not be consulted while questions demanded immediate attention from those who lacked access to guidance that had been carefully accumulated and systematically organized through centuries of patient scholarship and practical experience. The sealing procedures themselves demonstrated final acts of stewardship, as those responsible for closing critical passages took care to preserve what could be preserved, while denying access to what must be denied, creating locks that honored both security and hope. Barriers that protected without entirely precluding eventual return, should circumstances change in ways that made restoration possible. These measures reflected understanding that retreat need not mean permanent abandonment, that strategic withdrawal could serve long-term preservation, even when immediate prospects seemed hopeless, embedding possibility within necessity, while acknowledging that possibility might never become actuality. Silence settled over halls that had echoed with hammer and song for millennia, not the temporary quiet of rest between shifts, but the profound stillness that follows departure, when spaces designed for habitation become monuments to memory rather than centers of activity. The acoustic properties that had been carefully tuned to carry useful sound across vast distances now carried only echoes of evacuation, the last footsteps and final words transforming from communication into elegy, from coordination into commemoration of what had been lost and what had been preserved through loss, while the mountain's breath continued to circulate through passages designed for life, but now serving only preservation. The transformation proved irreversible, not through failure, but through success that had awakened forces making continuation impossible, as their very excellence in delving had disturbed powers that made guardianship meaningless rather than merely difficult. What had been covenant with stone became memory of covenant, carried forward not in halls, but in hearts, not in place, but in practice, creating new responsibilities for each generation to preserve through intention what could no longer be maintained through simple residence in spaces that had shaped their understanding of themselves and their relationship with the patient earth that had welcomed their tools for so many generations. What fills the spaces left by departed glory became not abstract inquiry, but immediate concern, as the vacuum created by organized withdrawal inevitably attracted entities seeking territory and resources, creating new arrangements that would honor different principles while occupying infrastructure designed according to different assumptions about the relationship between inhabitant and environment. The question hung over every echo like held breath, waiting for time to reveal which forces possessed sufficient strength and organization to claim inheritance that had been abandoned not through choice, but through necessity, that made all choices equally impossible, equally inevitable, and whether emptiness truly remains empty for long in a world that abhors waste and recognizes opportunity even in the remnants of others' greatest achievements. The question of what fills the spaces left by departed glory received its answer, not through noble succession, but through the base opportunism of creatures that recognized advantage in abandonment, demonstrating how emptiness in such places behaves like atmospheric pressure, drawing in whatever can survive the darkness and profit from the ruins of better work. What emerged was not mere occupation, but fundamental transformation, as Moria evolved from a crafted civilization into an entirely different ecosystem adapted to perpetual shadow, sustained by violence, and organized around proximity to the ancient malice that had driven out its builders, creating new forms of order that honored neither the mountain's original covenant nor the patient wisdom that had sustained harmony between inhabitant and stone for countless generations. Orcs arrived first among the colonizers, drawn by the scent of abandonment and the promise of shelter that required conquest rather than construction, their crude efficiency turning architectural mastery against itself as they adapted chambers designed for councils into barracks, transformed workshops into armories, and converted the elegant systems that had once carried Hammersong into networks for coordinating raids and territorial disputes. The great halls that had echoed with productive labor became territories claimed through violence rather than craft right, their boundaries marked not by guild membership, but by strength applied without wisdom. While the acoustic properties that had been designed to facilitate useful communication now served to amplify threats and coordinate attacks across distances that Dwarven engineers had calculated for entirely different purposes. The territorial divisions that emerged followed existing architecture because even creatures of ruin recognized utility when it offered advantage without requiring understanding. Yet their adaptation transformed every feature according to principles that valued immediate dominance over sustainable prosperity. Staircases became defensive positions where gravity served violence rather than ascent, while chambers designed for specific crafts were repurposed as lairs that honored appetite over skill, creating social arrangements where possession replaced making as the primary measure of worth, and proximity to danger became the source of authority rather than demonstrated competence in useful disciplines. Deeper in the mountain, where even orcs hesitated to establish permanent settlements, trolls and darker entity claimed territories in regions where the Balrog's influence had created conditions suitable only for creatures already adapted to corruption and shadow. These beings required neither the social organization that had enabled Dwarven civilization nor the basic infrastructure that supported even Orcish military camps, establishing dominion in spaces where normal rules of habitation no longer applied, their presence accelerating the transformation of passages that had been carved, according to careful calculation, into irregular routes that served movement without purpose, connection without meaning. The Balrog itself did not rule through counsel or command, yet its presence organized every life within the mountain as rivers organize valleys, creating gradients of fear and favor, along which the new social order arranged itself with grim efficiency. Tribes that claimed territory, closer to the source of ancient malice, gained prestige through their ability to survive proximity to destructive power, while those who maintained safer distances forfeited influence even as they preserved numbers, creating hierarchies based on tolerance for corruption rather than resistance to it, establishing incentive structures that rewarded adaptation to darkness rather than preservation of light. Without the constant attention that complex systems require, the mountain's sophisticated infrastructure began failing in cascading patterns that demonstrated how interdependent the various networks had been, each neglected component creating problems that spread through connected systems until entire regions became uninhabitable, even for creatures adapted to harsh conditions. Ventilation shafts designed to move breathable air according to temperature differentials clogged with refuse and careless modifications, creating stagnant pockets where corruption could flourish while denying circulation to areas where it was most desperately needed, transforming spaces that had been carefully balanced to support life into environments that actively threatened it. The water systems that had provided both power and cooling through generations of patient engineering acquired new, destructive rhythms as channels became contaminated through careless use and strategic neglect, their flows diverted to serve immediate military needs rather than long-term sustainability. Mills that had turned according to precise calculations now labored under accumulated silt and debris, their mechanisms grinding toward failure, while the cisterns that had stored reserves against seasonal variation stratified into layers that bred disease rather than providing security, creating new hazards from infrastructure that had once represented the pinnacle of safety and reliability. Each year of darkness made the halls stranger, as function divorced itself from form through processes that honored entropy rather than design, leaving chambers to develop new purposes without guidance from those who understood their original intentions. The gradual erasure of Dwarven legacy proceeded not through deliberate destruction, but through indifference to maintaining features whose significance was not immediately obvious to inhabitants whose needs and capabilities differed fundamentally from those of the builders, creating loss through neglect that proved more thorough than malice could have achieved through direct assault. Inscriptions weathered under conditions they had never been designed to endure, their careful lettering becoming illegible as protective treatments failed and atmospheric changes accelerated deterioration that should have required centuries rather than decades. Decorative elements that had embodied aesthetic principles developed over generations were damaged through careless contact or deliberate defacement, while the subtle harmonies that had made these spaces beautiful as well as functional were disrupted through modifications that served immediate utility while destroying qualities that had taken lifetimes to achieve and could not be restored through casual effort. The Watcher in the Water emerged as another consequence of long abandonment, settling into the stagnant pools that formed outside the west gate, where drainage systems had failed and maintenance had ceased, transforming the threshold that had once opened by friendship into a barrier guarded by hunger that recognized no password save violence. This entity, whatever its exact origins, demonstrated how abandonment created opportunities for forces that had been excluded not through active resistance, but through simple incompatibility with maintained civilization, showing how quickly protective measures could be overwhelmed when the vigilance that sustained them was withdrawn. Certain sealed spaces persisted even under the new regime, their barriers proving effective against inhabitants who lacked both knowledge and tools necessary for safe penetration of defenses designed by those who understood what they were protecting and why such protection was essential. These chambers became sources of both fascination and unease for the new inhabitants, representing power they could sense but not access, wisdom they could recognize but not comprehend, creating psychological pressures that influenced behavior patterns throughout the occupied territories, while preserving islands of mystery within the larger transformation. The persistence of these protected areas served as reminders that some forms of Dwarven achievement transcended mere physical construction, embodying principles that could survive even when the civilization that created them had been driven into exile. Maps and records that documented the breathing of the mountain still waited in sealed repositories, their contents preserved against time and violence, while the knowledge necessary for interpreting them traveled different roads toward uncertain destinations, creating separation between wisdom and application that made both more precious and more fragile. The costs of this occupation extended beyond obvious destruction to encompass changes in the essential character of spaces that had been consecrated through generations of patient craftwork, their transformation creating not just physical degradation, but spiritual corruption that affected the relationship between consciousness and environment in ways that would prove difficult to reverse, even if the practical challenges of restoration could be overcome. Each adaptation made by the new inhabitants served their immediate needs, while making future reclamation more difficult, creating momentum toward permanent change that operated independently of anyone's conscious intention. The question of whether a place can ever be truly reclaimed once it has been fundamentally changed by different kinds of inhabitants became more than theoretical speculation as the transformation proceeded through stages that seemed to create increasing barriers to restoration, each modification making the next more likely, while making reversal more complex. The answer would depend not just on the practical challenges of rebuilding, but on deeper issues about the relationship between place and purpose, between physical space and spiritual significance, between what could be reconstructed and what could be recovered, suggesting that some transformations might prove irreversible, not because of technical limitations, but because of fundamental changes in the nature of what was being transformed. What remained to be seen was whether the mountain itself retained memory of its former purpose, whether stone could remember the covenant that had once made it cooperative, and whether forces existed that might one day challenge the new ecology of ruin with sufficient strength and wisdom to restore not just the halls, but the harmony that had made them meaningful to those who carved them, from cooperative darkness into spaces where light could flourish and craft could serve purposes greater than mere survival. The question of whether a place could ever be truly reclaimed, once fundamentally changed by different inhabitants, found its answer not through philosophical contemplation, but through the desperate arithmetic of war. As the scattered children of Dwarven discovered that witnessing their ancestral halls transformed into an ecology of ruin created wounds that demanded action, even when action could not restore what had been lost. The news that traveled from hold to hold spoke not just of occupation, but of defilement, of sacred spaces converted to crude purposes, of inscriptions defaced and thresholds marked with orcish boasts over achievements they could never have accomplished, creating pressures within the Dwarven diaspora that transformed individual grief into collective rage, demanding expression through the only language their enemies would understand. The War of the Dwarves and Orcs emerged from this accumulated anguish as a form of cultural therapy, allowing a people whose narrative had been defined by retreat and abandonment to reclaim at least the memory of their dignity through coordinated action that honored their martial traditions while acknowledging the impossibility of true restoration. What began with the murder of Thror in the halls that had once been his inheritance provided the catalyst that united grievances too long endured in isolation, transforming scattered resentments into unified purpose that would demonstrate both the strength that remained to them and the limitations that exile had imposed upon even their combined capabilities. The alliance that formed represented unprecedented cooperation among the 7 Dwarven houses, each setting aside ancient rivalries and independent policies to answer summons carried not by herald alone, but by kinship, oath, and the old grammar of grief spoken in Khazad-dûm that required no translation among those who shared the burden of displacement. Long beards came first, as befitted their proximity to injury, while contingents from western ranges and distant eastern kindreds arrived along mountain roads worn by trade, but tightened by purpose, bringing standards, provisions, and the stubborn silence of those who had chosen action over endless deliberation about circumstances that could not be changed through council debate or diplomatic negotiation. The strategic decision to fight for the approaches to Moria, rather than attempting direct reclamation of the halls themselves, revealed wisdom born from bitter experience. Understanding that some objectives remained beyond their capabilities, even when united in common cause. They would cut the ladders by which darkness climbed, rather than plunging into pits where ancient malice held advantage, focusing their efforts on achievable goals that could provide meaningful expression for their need to act while avoiding disasters that would compound existing losses through futile attempts to overcome forces that exceeded mortal comprehension, no matter how enhanced by unity and determination. The campaign progressed with methodical precision that impressed even cautious observers as dwarven columns moved like chisels along passes, driving strikes that were less battles than excisions, removing orc strongholds and sealing mountain throats through stonecraft turned to warfare. Logistics became scripture as grain stores were calculated for endurance, charcoal allocated for cold nights, and axles inspected for carts that must not fail on narrow ledges where mechanical failure could prove more devastating than enemy action, while coordination proceeded through signals that had once guided commerce but were now reassigned to the tempo of war. Bronze plates carrying coded taps through ravines, while flags marked advances without betraying positions to watchful eyes. Among the warriors marched figures whose names would echo through subsequent generations, including young Balin, whose presence at this terrible accounting would plant seeds of obsession that would eventually drive him toward his own doomed attempt at reclamation decades later. The dwarf who distinguished himself through valor at Azanul-Bizar would carry forward not just pride in proven capability, but dangerous awareness of how close they had come to meaningful restoration. How narrow the margin between achievement and disaster, creating psychological pressures that would influence his later decisions when opportunity seemed to present itself again under different circumstances that would prove equally treacherous. The Battle of Azanul-Bizar itself unfolded beneath the very peaks of their lost kingdom. In the dale the elves called Nanduhirion, where streams wove the ground like bright threads, awaiting a loom that would never come. The day began cold and clean, sunlight striking the snows of Celebdil and Fanwidhol, while Caradhras kept his red thoughts veiled, and below lay the Mirror Mere, too calm for comfort, its surface reflecting not just light, but the entire arc of hope and despair that had brought them to this moment of terrible reckoning, where courage would be tested against arithmetic that favored neither side, but demanded payment from both. The slopes initially worked against dwarven formations, cutting their ranks into costly fragments, and turning shields into sleds whenever footing failed on ground, made treacherous by winter's grip. Yet their discipline held through rotations that followed forge schedules, each unit holding measured time before yielding to the next in withdrawals, so controlled and returns so exact that the valley's irregular floor gradually yielded defensive lines that could be maintained. When Thorin's shield was hewn to splinters under the press, and an oak branch snatched in desperate need became both emblem and device, it steadied those around him, while demonstrating how necessity could transform any material into instrument of survival when wielded with proper understanding and unwavering resolve. The arithmetic of victory proved more terrible than any defeat might have been, as Dwarven superiority in individual combat and tactical coordination could not eliminate the numerical advantages that orc reproduction rates provided, creating exchanges where every success carried costs that represented irreplaceable losses to populations already reduced by exile and dispersal. They won the field while losing the capacity to hold it, proved their martial excellence while confirming their essential homelessness, achieved their tactical objectives while suffering casualties that would echo through generations in the form of widows, orphans, and empty places at tables where stories were told, and wisdom passed between those who remained to carry forward traditions that had been purchased with blood that could never be replaced. When Azog himself came down late like an insult delayed, banking on terror more than tactics, he found instead calculation no mockery could erase, meeting his end at the hands of Dane of the Iron Hills in combat that was brief, final, and unspectacular to those beyond the immediate circle, like a clasp snapping at last under pressure that had been building for generations. The white hand that had scrawled taunts lay empty of command, and orc messengers scattered without orders or hope. Yet victory announced itself without triumph, arriving as fatigue so complete that weapons felt like questions left unanswered, and silence that grew wider than the valley itself could contain. The costs extended beyond the obvious casualties to encompass transformation of identity that would affect every subsequent generation, as the dwarves discovered that proving their capability to inflict consequences upon their enemies did not restore their sense of purpose or provide direction for future development that could address the fundamental challenges of their displacement. The satisfaction of having demonstrated worthiness as inheritors of their martial traditions competed with bitter awareness that worthiness alone could not overcome circumstances, demanding capabilities they did not possess and could not acquire through conventional means, creating internal tensions that would influence every subsequent decision about risk, commitment, and the proper relationship between memory and hope. The recognition that some losses cannot be avenged, only mourned, emerged gradually as implications of their victory became clear, forcing confrontation with reality that military success could not restore their covenant with stone, could not resurrect their kings, could not undo fundamental transformation that had made their ancestral home uninhabitable for any who lacked power to contend with forces exceeding mortal comprehension. The war had cleansed the mountains of orc presence while leaving the deep places unchanged, creating a situation where strategic success felt indistinguishable from strategic failure, except in memories of those who survived to remember both cost and achievement. Both pride and futility intertwined like threads in cloth that could warm but never fully comfort. Whether there is wisdom in accepting permanent loss, or whether hope itself becomes a form of duty to the dead, remained question that each survivor had to answer individually, as collective solutions proved inadequate to address challenges operating at intersection of personal meaning and historical circumstance. Some found peace in acknowledging what could not be changed, while others, like Balin, carried forward conviction that duty to memory required continued attempts at restoration regardless of practical obstacles or reasonable assessment of probable outcomes, creating divisions within their culture that would influence every subsequent generation's relationship with their displaced identity, and obligations to ancestors whose achievements had become both inspiration and burden, both treasure to be preserved and weight to be carried through years of wandering that stretched ahead like an endless stair leading toward destinations that remained perpetually obscured by mist and uncertainty. The question of whether hope itself becomes a form of duty to the dead found its most complete and tragic expression decades later when Balin, son of Fundin, chose to transform memory of Azanul-Bizar's Pyrrhic victory into practical action, leading a carefully selected company back toward halls that had haunted his dreams since youth spent listening to stories of what had been lost and what might yet be recovered through courage applied with wisdom rather than desperation. His decision emerged not from careful calculation of probable success, but from conviction that some obligations transcend reasonable assessment of risk, that memory itself creates responsibilities which cannot be discharged through acceptance of permanent loss, even when acceptance might represent the wiser course for those who valued survival over meaning, comfort over duty to ancestors whose achievements demanded either restoration or worthy failure in the attempt to honor their legacy. The company that followed Balin into Moria represented not military expedition, but colony in miniature, bringing skills and supplies necessary for establishing permanent presence rather than conducting raids or reconnaissance. Their preparations reflecting understanding that reclamation would require years of patient work rather than dramatic gestures of martial prowess or ring-enhanced ambition that had driven their ancestors toward catastrophe. Among them were Oin the healer, Ori the scribe, and Floy, son of Loni, each carrying different strands of memory bound into the same resolve. Veterans who remembered techniques for working in dangerous conditions, alongside younger craftsmen eager to prove themselves worthy inheritors of traditions that had survived exile, but required expression through action rather than mere preservation in story and song. The practical challenges of reclaiming a macro city with a micro population revealed themselves immediately upon entry, as the vast scale of Khazad-dûm's architecture created security requirements that exceeded their capabilities regardless of individual skill or collective determination, forcing recognition that halls designed to accommodate thousands could not be effectively defended by dozens, while passages that had once facilitated efficient movement between districts now provided countless routes for infiltration by enemies who possessed intimate knowledge gained through generations of occupation. Their approach necessarily focused on establishing defensive positions that could be maintained by small numbers, creating choke points where few could delay many, while maintaining communication between scattered outposts through signals that utilized existing architectural features. Yet these arrangements could provide only temporary security against determined assault. The Chamber of Records, where Balin established his primary headquarters, offered both practical advantages in terms of defensibility and symbolic significance, as repository of knowledge that connected their efforts to the broader history of Dwarven achievement in these halls, while the 21st Hall became their main workshop and gathering place, its proportions reduced from grandeur to functionality through necessity that honored survival over aesthetic considerations. The restoration of basic systems proved even more challenging than anticipated, as decades of neglect and deliberate sabotage had created cascading failures throughout interconnected networks that had once made underground civilization possible, requiring repairs that demanded both technical expertise and resources that were not readily available to a small company operating without external support from the kingdoms that had grown cautious about ventures that recalled the ring-enhanced overreach of earlier generations. For a time, success felt like dawn refusing to be hurried, yet undeniably arriving, as small gardens of fungi and hardy roots took filtered light from mirrored chimneys, while quenched forges offered their slight warmth to rooms that remembered the heat of greater works, creating atmosphere where hope seemed justified by achievement, measured not in grand restoration, but in simple continuation of Dwarven presence in spaces that had known their people's voices for millennia. The old language returned to walls in chalk and charcoal, brief notices in runes for those who needed to coordinate without announcing themselves to listening foes, while way stations were stocked at intervals for fighting withdrawals that all understood might be necessary, each cache logged twice on vellum, and once in memory according to procedures that balanced optimism with realism about their situation's inherent instability. The Book of Records became their second hearth, gathering around it not embers, but entries, the daily accumulation of decisions that turn endurance into history through Ori's careful hand, tracing events with an accountant's clarity and a poet's restraint, listing provisions taken and passages cleared alongside notes on mood, rumor, and the mountain's responsiveness to their presence. When the declaration came that Balin was lord in Moria, it rang not with pomp, but with craftsman's steadiness, more like a level-set true than trumpet call, statement of assumption of care rather than seizure of dominion, acknowledging that lordship in such circumstances meant stewardship of memory as much as governance of territory, responsibility for preserving what could be preserved while accepting what could not be restored to its former glory. The isolation from outside support that their position demanded created psychological pressures that proved as challenging as physical dangers, as the company found themselves cut off from communities that had provided social connection and cultural continuity during long years of exile, forced to maintain morale and purpose through internal resources alone, while facing constant reminders of how much had been lost and how little could be recovered through their efforts despite dedication that exceeded any reasonable measure of duty. Messages sent to relatives and allies in other settlements went unanswered, whether through failure of delivery or deliberate decision to avoid association with enterprise that many considered doomed from its inception, creating sense of abandonment that compounded every other difficulty they faced in their attempt to maintain civilization in circumstances that seemed designed to defeat such efforts. Constant attrition from orc attacks gradually reduced their numbers, while consuming resources that could not be replaced, creating downward spiral where each loss made subsequent defense more difficult while reducing workforce available for essential maintenance and expansion activities, the mathematics of survival working against them with inexorable logic as their enemies could afford losses that represented temporary setbacks, while every dwarven casualty constituted irreplaceable reduction in capabilities essential for continued operation. Counter-movements began as murmurs, orc scouts testing perimeters and learning new rhythms before calling to their kin with excitement of scavengers who had found not carrion alone, but table being set, their attacks exploiting shafts that could not yet be controlled, and angles that had once been safe, but now served surprise, each victory on the dwarves' part, costing weapon's edge or man's sleep, while each loss of patrol demanded reinforcements that could not be spared. The drums that answered drums in the deep places provided final confirmation that forces beyond their comprehension remained active in regions they could not access or influence, creating acoustic phenomena that suggested presence of entities whose purposes remained opaque, but whose power exceeded any capacity for resistance that their small company could muster. These sounds beginning as distant percussion, barely distinguishable from settling stone, yet gradually acquiring rhythmic patterns that seemed to respond to their activities, growing stronger when work proceeded in certain directions, while diminishing when operations shifted elsewhere. The mountain itself participated not as adversary, but as complex partner whose systems required maintenance beyond the colony's means, vents cleared with laborious care, clogging again under winds that shifted without warning, while water whose course had been chastened returned to troublesome habits, refusing mills and pooling in corners where rot made its arguments without words. When Balin walked to the Mirror as petitioner to an elder, hoping for confirmation that presence had become belonging, the crown was there because stars were, and water remembers its duty to sky. Yet the arrow that found him spoke not of strategy, but of malice that cannot bear witness to reverence, its trajectory a straight line drawn across circle of his devotion, while those who bore him home did so without noise, the chamber that would hold his stone receiving its purpose with solemnity of instrument, accepting new note into its scale. After that, the colony fought not to win, but to keep its own form long enough to end with dignity, orcish pressure cohering into siege that was not continuous, but insistent, as if many small hammers striking in time could crack what no single blow could break, while drums in the deep moved closer, less sound than change in air the body feels before mind can name it. The well that became grave for Oin marked location where hopes finally encountered reality, too stark for optimism to survive, circumstances forcing recognition that their enterprise had been doomed not through failure of courage or inadequacy of preparation, but through fundamental misunderstanding of what restoration would require under conditions that had changed beyond their capacity to address through conventional means, while the book's final entries, charred and torn, nonetheless preserved the essential: names of fallen, places of stands, small courtesies of command under pressure. The record knowing difference between failure and completion, calling effort by its proper name, which was neither folly nor triumph, but offering. Whether some attempts at restoration are actually forms of sacrifice, offerings to memory rather than practical endeavors, became clear through Balin's enterprise, which succeeded in its deepest purpose, even as it failed in stated objectives, providing demonstration that duty to dead could be discharged through worthy effort regardless of outcome. That hope itself could serve as form of prayer offered not for success, but for meaning, creating legacy that honored ancestors, while acknowledging that some losses exceed any mortal capacity to repair, requiring forms of remembrance that transcend boundaries between victory and defeat, between restoration and commemoration, between what can be recovered and what must be carried forward through memory alone into futures that remain perpetually uncertain, yet somehow still worthy of effort required to reach them. The question of whether some attempts at restoration are forms of sacrifice found its ultimate answer, not through scholarly analysis, but through the arrival of 9 travelers whose passage would transform Balin's offering into the final movement of a symphony that had been building since Durin first glimpsed his starlit crown in patient waters, demonstrating how architecture could transcend mere backdrop, to become the primary actor in a drama whose resolution would honor both memory and necessity through destruction that served creation rather than mere preservation. The Fellowship of the Ring approached the West Gate not as conquerors seeking dominion or colonists planning settlement, but as reluctant pilgrims forced by winter and war to traverse halls that had become legendary for their beauty and terrible for their fate. Their journey revealing how Khazad-dûm would fulfill its deepest purpose, not through restoration, but through catastrophic completion of designs that had been embedded in stone by builders who understood that the greatest architecture serves survival as well as splendor. The West Gate's riddle lock, which had once opened by friendship to welcome Celebrimbor's people from Eregion, now forced the Fellowship to announce their presence through the very mechanism designed to facilitate connection rather than concealment, its elegant inscription demanding not mere password, but genuine understanding of the relationship between wisdom and humility that had defined the original alliance. When Gandalf spoke the Elvish word for friend, he activated systems that had waited through centuries of abandonment for voices capable of remembering what welcome meant. Yet this opening simultaneously served notice to every inhabitant of the mountain that new players had entered the ancient game, transforming the gate from barrier into herald, while eliminating stealth as option, and compelling the company toward encounters that had been building toward inevitability since drums first answered drums in the deep places. The Watcher in the Water, that consequence of failed drainage and patient neglect which had settled into stagnant pools, where sophisticated systems once managed flow with precision, demonstrated how abandonment transforms protective measures into active threats. Its violent intervention sealing the Fellowship's retreat, while ensuring that their only path led deeper into regions where ancient malice held dominion over spaces designed for entirely different purposes. The creature's assault served not merely as obstacle, but as catalyst, eliminating choice while compelling forward movement along routes that would channel them inexorably toward the mountain's heart, where architecture would complete lessons that had been interrupted by exile, but never forgotten by stone that remembers everything. Within the mountain, the great roads that had once facilitated efficient movement between thriving districts now channeled the Fellowship's passage along predictable routes that offered both guidance and vulnerability, their design serving enemies who had learned to use Dwarven planning against itself, while providing travelers with paths that remained navigable despite centuries of neglect and deliberate sabotage. These thoroughfares, carved according to principles that honored both efficiency and beauty, drew the company deeper through calculated grades and measured curves that had once guided streams of productive traffic, forcing movement along lines determined by absent hands, while demonstrating how even ruined architecture retains authority over those who accept its guidance, teaching obedience through geometry that makes resistance more difficult than compliance. The Chamber of Records, where they discovered Balin's tomb, and the book that chronicled Hope's transformation into sacrifice, served as more than memorial to failed enterprise, becoming instead the place where past and present converged through written testimony that connected the Fellowship's urgent mission to the longer story of Dwarven ambition and its ultimate cost. The reading of Ori's final entries, performed by Gandalf in tones that honored both courage and futility, provided context that transformed their passage from simple traverse of dangerous territory into pilgrimage through spaces consecrated by dedication and loss, while the sounds of their discovery traveled along acoustic channels designed to carry useful communication, but now serving to announce disturbance to forces that had been waiting in darkness for new provocation to awaken them from dormancy that had been mistaken for defeat. The drums that began beating in response to their presence created pressure that transformed architecture into instrument of coordination between entities whose purposes remained opaque, but whose power exceeded any mortal capacity for resistance, their rhythmic patterns utilizing the mountain's sophisticated acoustic properties in ways never intended by original designers, turning systems meant to facilitate cooperation into networks that served malice while retaining functional effectiveness. These sounds pressed against consciousness like accumulated atmospheric pressure seeking release, building tension that would find resolution only through confrontation that had been building toward inevitability since the first excessive delving had disturbed powers that should have remained undisturbed in the Earth's deepest foundations. The bridge of Khazad-dûm revealed its ultimate purpose, not through preservation, but through destruction, its narrow span finally fulfilling the defensive role for which it had been designed, by creating choke point where one could hold against many, not to achieve victory, but to purchase time for others to escape, while demonstrating how some structures achieve completion only through catastrophic fulfillment of embedded intentions. Gandalf's recognition of the bridge's strategic possibilities represented more than tactical awareness, but literacy in architectural language that turned space into strategy. His stand against the Balrog, transforming elegant engineering into stage for sacrifice that honored both mathematical precision and moral necessity, while proving that the greatest designs serve purposes their creators could envision but never fully anticipate. When the bridge collapsed beneath the Balrog's weight, it demonstrated how destruction can serve creation when applied according to principles that honor both immediate necessity and ultimate meaning. The creature's fall, seeming to conclude drama that had begun with ring-enhanced overreach yet masking deeper truth that some conflicts require resolution through engagement that transcends simple categories of victory and defeat. The apparent ending proved to be transformation, as both combatants descended into depths where the endless stare waited to provide framework for battle that would honor the mountain's memory, while enabling futures that could not be preserved through simple maintenance of what had been, requiring instead forms of completion that transcend boundaries between ending and beginning. The endless stare, which had served as escape route during original evacuation and testing ground for those who would work at unprecedented depths, became the stage for confrontation that transformed both participants through engagement operating according to principles exceeding normal comprehension of cause and effect, their struggle ascending from regions where ancient malice had slumbered toward heights where starlight could witness resolution of forces set in motion by choices made in ages past. The stairs demanding vertical circulation, designed to test worthiness through physical and spiritual preparation, now served as arena where ultimate questions about the relationship between light and darkness, wisdom and power, sacrifice and meaning would be answered, not through debate, but through action that honored both necessity and choice. At Durin's tower, where the stair emerged into daylight after its spiral ascent from profound darkness, the battle reached resolution that honored both combatants, while demonstrating how architecture could provide framework for transformation rather than mere destruction, ancient stones bearing witness to confrontation that would reshape understanding of what victory could mean when applied to conflicts transcending normal boundaries between personal and cosmic significance. The tower's position, commanding views across peaks that had witnessed the entire arc of Dwarven achievement and loss, provided appropriate setting for conclusion that would honor both the mountain's memory and the necessity of moving beyond memory toward futures that remained to be written by those who survived to carry forward what could be preserved through forms of remembrance exceeding simple maintenance of place. The Fellowship's emergence into the Dimril Dale, traumatized but alive, marked completion of the mountain's role not as dwelling place or workshop, but as stage where ancient conflicts could reach conclusions that honored both achievements and failures of those who had carved meaning from cooperative stone. Their passage had awakened what slept fitfully, yet in leaving, they left behind argument resolved through breaking rather than mending, bridge gone, because it had fulfilled its purpose, stair proven through bearing what only it could sustain. Architecture serving its final function, not through preservation, but through providing framework within which destruction could serve creation, and endings could enable beginnings that honored both what had been lost and what might yet be preserved. What it means for a place to fulfill its ultimate purpose through destruction, rather than preservation, and whether some designs are completed only when they are broken, became clear through Moria's transformation from monument to memory into instrument of resolution, its halls serving not as museum of past achievement, but as active participant in drama, whose conclusion demonstrated that some forms of completion require not maintenance, but sacrifice, not preservation, but transformation, not simple continuation of what has been, but creation of conditions within which what matters most can survive the destruction of everything that seemed essential, yet proved, in the end, to be merely the vessel rather than the treasure it was designed to carry forward into futures that could honor the past precisely by refusing to be imprisoned by it. The completion that came, through breaking rather than preservation, brings us back to where we began, beside the mirror mere, where starlight still crowns the water with ancient fidelity. Yet now the reflection carries more than celestial radiance, holding within its depths the full arc of rise and glory, fall and consequence that we have traced together, through halls that echo with memory rather than hammer song. The crown that Durin first glimpsed in these patient waters appears unchanged by time and catastrophe, its 7 points arranged in perfect symmetry above waters that have witnessed both triumph and tragedy. Yet our understanding has been transformed through witnessing how ambition and ancient forces converge in patterns that reveal Moria's fate was written not in malicious decree, but in the very nature of mortal excellence encountering powers that existed beyond the reach of any craft, no matter how ring-enhanced or sophisticated its application might become. The synthesis of our journey's revelations shows how Khazad-dûm embodied from its very conception the fundamental tension between achievement and restraint, between the drive to discover and the wisdom to recognize when discovery approaches boundaries that should not be crossed without preparation exceeding any mortal capacity to provide. Durin's moment of mystical recognition beside these same waters established a covenant based on harmony between dwarf and mountain. Yet that very harmony enabled achievements so magnificent that they created temptation to mistake fluency for authorship, cooperation for dominion, enhancement for immunity to consequence that had governed the relationship between mortal craft and cosmic order since the world's foundation. The 7 rings revealed themselves not as instruments of simple corruption, but as amplifiers that magnified existing dwarven excellences until they exceeded the boundaries within which they could be safely expressed, transforming virtues into vulnerabilities through processes so gradual that each step seemed reasonable, while the overall trajectory led inexorably toward awakening forces that had been deliberately buried in darkness, for reasons that became horrifyingly clear only when disturbance had progressed beyond any possibility of reversal. Mithril sang because it bridged matter and spirit, yet that very song drew them deeper into regions where the mountain's familiar voice gave way to harmonics that carried echoes of something far older and more powerful than themselves, something that spoke through resonance with intentions that remained mysterious, but undeniably present. The lasting mechanisms of Moria's legacy operate through forms of influence that transcend simple cause and effect, as the abandoned halls continue to shape Middle-earth's geography and politics, not through active intervention, but through their silence, creating vacuum that draws attention while reshaping trade routes, diplomatic arrangements, and strategic calculations throughout the region in ways that demonstrate how even empty places can govern as effectively as occupied ones when absence becomes presence through the weight of memory and the persistence of consequence. The story itself has become what we might call portable architecture, a hall of counsel raised inside the mind of any who listen long enough to hear its deeper rhythms, teaching through example rather than precept, about the delicate balance between exploration and reverence, between capability and responsibility, between the drive to achieve and the understanding that some achievements can only be measured by their capacity to teach rather than their ability to endure. Yet the costs that seemed so devastating when experienced as immediate loss revealed themselves through longer perspective as gifts whose value could not be recognized until sufficient time had passed to allow proper evaluation of what had been preserved through what appeared to be destruction, demonstrating how wisdom sometimes arrives disguised as disaster, while disaster often wears the mask of triumph until circumstances provide clarity that can only be gained through retrospective understanding. The loss of Khazad-dûm preserved its people by forcing dispersal that prevented total annihilation, while the abandonment of the halls preserved their memory by ensuring that what had been achieved there remained frozen at its moment of highest accomplishment rather than subjected to gradual decline that would have diminished significance through casual modification or simple passage of time. The silence that followed evacuation preserved lessons that only ruin can teach, creating conditions where subsequent generations could learn through contemplation rather than experience about the relationship between mortal ambition and forces that operate according to principles exceeding any single civilization's understanding or control, while the sealed chambers that even orcs feared to breach continue to hold maps and records that wait like seeds against another spring, kept from corruption by secrecy, that, for once, served openness to futures that remain unwritten, yet somehow still worthy of the effort required to reach them. Our guiding question about the hidden depths of Moria finds its resolution in recognition that these depths were never merely geographical dimensions to be measured in levels and shafts, but spiritual territories where ambition meets limitation, where craft encounters mystery, where the greatest wisdom lies in knowing when to stop before crossing thresholds that transform cooperation into conquest, enhancement into excess, achievement into the kind of success that proves indistinguishable from failure, except through perspective that can only be gained after sufficient time has passed to allow proper evaluation of ultimate consequences, rather than immediate results. The covenant between dwarf and mountain that began with mystical recognition reveals its ultimate meaning not through successful maintenance of original terms, but through transformation that honored essential principles while acknowledging that circumstances change in ways that require adaptation rather than simple persistence, demonstrating that true loyalty sometimes requires abandonment of what cannot be preserved in order to save what can be carried forward through forms of remembrance that transcend simple occupation of place. The mountain's cooperation was withdrawn not through betrayal, but through awakening of forces whose presence made cooperation impossible. While the Dwarven response proved that some forms of treasure can only be saved by being carried rather than defended, preserved in memory and tradition rather than stone and steel. The water still reflects the stars, because some forms of beauty transcend the circumstances that reveal them, while the crown of memory gleams eternal, because it represents not temporal authority, but timeless recognition of harmony between mortal purpose and cosmic order, between individual achievement and universal principles that govern the relationship between making and meaning across all ages and circumstances. In this final reflection, we see that Khazad-dûm's greatest achievement was not its halls or treasures, but its transformation into wisdom that could be carried forward by those who learned through its example about the proper relationship between capability and restraint, between exploration and reverence, between what we can accomplish and what we can understand about the forces that shape our world, according to patterns that exceed any single perspective, yet remain accessible to those who approach them with appropriate humility. The reflection carries forward not just light but understanding, not just image but instruction, teaching that the deepest truths about ambition and ancient forces can only be learned through stories that bridge the gap between individual experience and universal principle, between temporal achievement and eternal meaning. While the mountain keeps its patient counsel in silence that speaks more eloquently than any active instruction could provide, offering guidance that operates through reflection rather than direction, through memory rather than presence, through the enduring recognition that some depths are best explored through contemplation rather than excavation, some treasures best preserved through distance rather than possession, and some forms of mastery best achieved through understanding when not to act rather than knowing how to proceed.